From the outside looking in, Christopher Lee Watts appeared to be the kind of man who had it all. Born on May 16, 1985, in Fayetteville, North Carolina, Chris grew up in what seemed to be a stable, middle-class household. His father, Ronnie Watts, worked hard to provide for the family, while his mother, Cindy Watts, was deeply involved in her children's lives. Chris was described by those who knew him as shy, polite, and reserved, a boy who loved cars, sports, and quiet hobbies more than crowds or parties. As a teenager, Chris was not the type to stand out in a room. He was not the loudest, nor was he the most charismatic, but he carried himself with a quiet determination. Teachers and friends recalled him as dependable, a good kid who stayed out of trouble. Cars quickly became one of his greatest passions. He could spend hours under the hood of a vehicle, taking it apart, fixing it, and rebuilding it with patience and skill. This mechanical interest followed him into adulthood, eventually leading him into a career as an oil field operator, a job that required long hours but paid well enough to provide a comfortable life. By his mid-20s, Chris was still seen as a simple, hard-working man with little drama in his life. That changed in 2010 when he met Shanann Catherine Zusick. Shanann was everything Chris wasn't: outgoing, energetic, charismatic, and highly active on social media. Born in 1984 in New Jersey, she had faced her own struggles, including health issues and setbacks, but she carried herself with determination and pride. She was fiercely ambitious, confident, and openly affectionate, and she knew how to capture attention both in person and online. The two met through mutual connections on Facebook. In one of her later social media posts, Shanann recalled almost ignoring Chris when he first reached out, but something about his persistence caught her eye. Where Chris was soft-spoken and reserved, Shanann was vocal and driven. Their differences seemed to balance each other, and before long, they began dating. Friends and family noticed that Chris seemed captivated by Shanann. He went along with her energy, appearing happy to be swept up into her world. Within a couple of years, their relationship had grown serious, and in 2012, they married in Charlotte, North Carolina. The wedding photos portrayed a smiling young couple, seemingly excited to start their new life together. After their marriage, Chris and Shanann moved to Colorado to build a fresh future. They settled in the town of Frederick, a quiet community north of Denver. In 2013, they purchased a large 5-bedroom home in a newly developed neighborhood. With its manicured lawns, spacious design, and family-friendly appeal, the house became the stage for what looked like the perfect suburban life. Soon after, the couple welcomed their first daughter, Bella Marie, in December 2013. Their second daughter, Celeste, affectionately called Cece, was born in July 2015. By all outward appearances, the Watts family was complete: a loving husband, a devoted wife, 2 beautiful daughters, and a comfortable home in a safe neighborhood. Shanann, always active on Facebook, shared countless photos and videos of their life together. Her social media presence painted an image of the perfect family. She often praised Chris in her posts, calling him the best husband and father. Videos showed Chris playing with his daughters, attending birthday parties, and smiling for the camera. To the outside world, it seemed like a picture, perfect marriage built on love and teamwork. But beneath that polished image, quiet cracks were beginning to form. Financial struggles weighed heavily on the couple. The purchase of their large home, combined with everyday expenses and a lifestyle that appeared comfortable but was supported by loans, began to take its toll. At one point, the couple filed for bankruptcy, highlighting the stress that money placed on their marriage. Shanann, working as a sales representative for a health and wellness company, often traveled for business and leaned heavily on social media to present her life as not only successful but enviable. Chris, meanwhile, continued to work long hours in the oil industry, sometimes exhausted, sometimes withdrawn, while Shanann's online world painted her husband as a caring and loving partner. Chris's quiet demeanor sometimes came across differently in private. Friends of Shannan's noticed that while she carried most of the energy in the relationship, Chris often remained in the background, agreeable but distant. This dynamic raised few red flags at the time. Many assumed that Chris was simply the quiet type, and that Shannan's assertive personality took the lead naturally. Still, the contrast between what was presented publicly and what was happening privately grew more distinct. Shanann, deeply invested in maintaining the perfect family image, often showcased their marriage as strong and loving, while Chris increasingly withdrew into himself. In 2018, Shanann announced another pregnancy. The couple was expecting their third child, a boy they planned to name Nico. To friends and family, this was exciting news, and Shanann documented her pregnancy journey online as she had with her daughters. But privately, this pregnancy added even more strain to a marriage already burdened with debt, long work hours, and unspoken tensions. Neighbors would later say that they rarely saw the couple fight publicly. They appeared to get along, attending community events and raising their daughters with affection. But Shanann confided in close friends that she sometimes felt distant from Chris, noticing his lack of enthusiasm and emotional detachment. The once adoring husband seemed to be drifting away, though no one could have imagined just how dark that drift would become. By the summer of 2018, the Watts family still looked perfect to outsiders. Smiling family photos lined Shannan's social media, showing playful daughters, a doting father, and a glowing mother preparing to welcome a new baby. But in reality, their marriage was cracking under the weight of financial trouble, emotional disconnect, and secrets that Chris had begun to keep hidden from everyone, including his wife. What looked like the picture of a happy suburban family was, in truth, a fragile facade. Behind the carefully curated images was a man quietly leading a double life, one that would soon shatter everything. By 2018, the Watts family's outward appearance still seemed to represent the American dream. A young couple with two beautiful daughters, a new baby on the way, and a spacious home in suburban Colorado. But beneath the surface, Chris Watts was living a life that contradicted everything his wife proudly displayed on social media. Chris had begun an affair. While working at Anadarko Petroleum, an oil company where he served as an operator, Chris met a woman named Nicole Kessinger. Nicole worked in the environmental department at the same company, and the two first crossed paths in the spring of 2018. At first, their interactions were professional, but Chris soon began to show interest. He presented himself to Nicole as a man nearing the end of a failing marriage. He told her he and Shanann were in the process of separating, a lie that would pave the way for their relationship. Nicole later revealed in interviews that she believed Chris's marriage was essentially over. He described himself as a father trying to find happiness again, someone whose wife was no longer interested in him. For Nicole, Chris seemed attentive, caring, and romantic, a man willing to start fresh. She had no idea that behind the curtain, his wife Shanann was not only still devoted to him, but also pregnant with their third child. As their relationship deepened, Chris began to transform. The quiet, reserved man who once blended into the background suddenly started working out more, changing his diet, and taking greater care in his appearance. Friends of Shanann noticed the change. While Chris had always been relatively low-key, now he seemed to have a newfound confidence, almost as if he were living for someone else. Meanwhile, Shanann, pregnant and often traveling for her work with a health and wellness company, sensed the distance growing between her and Chris. In July 2018, she traveled to North Carolina with her daughters for a summer visit to see her family. During that trip, she texted friends about her worries. Chris, who stayed behind in Colorado, grew colder and more detached. He called less, seemed uninterested in conversation, and acted distant when Shanann tried to connect. Shanann confided in her friends that she felt something was wrong. At one point, she texted a friend, "He doesn't want the baby. He has changed. He doesn't want to kiss me anymore." Her instincts were right. Chris's attention was no longer on his family, but on the woman he was secretly seeing. The marriage had other strains as well. Financial troubles continued to weigh heavily on the couple. Their large home, while beautiful, was a burden they could barely afford. Bills piled up, and their bankruptcy years earlier had left them struggling to regain stability. Shanann was determined to make her business succeed, often pouring her energy into sales and social media promotion. Chris, on the other hand, seemed increasingly uninterested in their shared responsibilities. When Shanann returned to Colorado in early August 2018, she noticed an even bigger change in her husband. Chris had grown distant, cold, and evasive. He no longer showed the same warmth toward her or the girls. Friends noticed as well. Chris, once seen as a quiet but attentive father, now seemed emotionally checked out. The affair with Nicole continued to intensify. The two went on dates, spent nights together, and exchanged countless messages. Chris began to fantasize about a future with her, one free of the financial struggles, marital disagreements, and parental responsibilities that weighed him down. In his mind, starting over with Nicole promised excitement and freedom. Shanann, sensing her marriage was in serious jeopardy, decided to confront the issue head-on. On August 9, 2018, she traveled to Arizona for a business trip. During that time, she texted Chris, pouring out her feelings about his emotional distance. She told him she felt unloved and unwanted, desperately seeking reassurance that their marriage could be saved. Chris responded with vague, detached messages that gave her little comfort. In her texts, Shanann pleaded for honesty, writing things like, "I don't know how you fell out of love with me in 5.5 weeks. I don't know how you can sleep knowing you're doing this to me. I don't know how you can be okay with this." These messages showed her growing awareness that something had shifted drastically in her husband. On August 13, 2018, just a day after returning from her business trip, Shanann was scheduled for a doctor's appointment to check on her pregnancy. She was excited to hear her baby boy's heartbeat, but Chris showed little interest. That morning, after being dropped off from the airport by a friend, Shanann walked back into her home, unaware that her husband's double life had already reached a terrifying breaking point. Chris was living in two worlds, one as the husband and father of 3, and the other as the passionate new partner to a woman who believed his marriage was ending. The pressure of keeping those worlds separate was mounting. Chris knew Shanann suspected something, and he feared his carefully crafted illusion was beginning to unravel. Psychologists would later point to this as the moment when Chris became trapped in his own lies. On one side was his wife, his children, and the responsibilities of family life. On the other side was the thrill of a new relationship and the fantasy of starting fresh. Chris, unable to reconcile the two, began to entertain thoughts that would lead him down a horrifying and irreversible path. Friends who spoke to Shanann during this time recalled her as worried, but determined to save her marriage. She still loved Chris and wanted their family to remain intact. She was planning their future, preparing for their baby boy's arrival, and fighting to hold onto the man she had once believed was her soulmate. But Chris's actions showed a different story. In the weeks before the tragedy, he searched online for topics like divorce, separation, and even how child support might impact him financially. He also looked up vacation getaways and jewelry for nickel, clearly envisioning a life beyond his current marriage. The cracks in the Watts marriage had widened into a canyon, one too deep to repair. And yet, Shanann never gave up hope. Even as she grew suspicious of his betrayal, she believed there was a chance to bring him back, to remind him of the love they had built and the family they had created together. She could not have imagined that instead of reconciliation, Chris was plotting the unthinkable. August 13th, 2018, began like any other summer morning in Frederick, Colorado. The suburban neighborhood was quiet, the homes lined with freshly cut grass and neatly parked cars. But inside the Watts family house on Saratoga Trail, a nightmare was unfolding, one that would shock the world and destroy the illusion of a perfect family forever. Shanann Watts had returned home in the early hours of the morning, just after 2:00 a.m., from a business trip to Arizona. A friend and coworker, Nicole Atkinson, had dropped her off at the door. Tired, but eager to see her daughters the next day, Shanann walked inside, unaware that Chris was already wide awake, his mind racing with dark intentions. According to his later confession, the confrontation began almost immediately. Shanann, just 13 weeks pregnant with their third child, wanted to talk about the state of their marriage. She had been feeling his distance for weeks and was desperate to reconnect. Chris, however, had already made up his mind. In his version of events, Shanann accused him of cheating, a suspicion that was true. He admitted he was seeing someone else and told her he no longer wanted the baby. A heated argument followed, one that escalated quickly as emotions spilled over. In those early morning hours, Chris claimed he felt trapped, torn between the family he had built and the new life he envisioned with another woman. Then came the moment that would forever brand him as one of the most notorious family annihilators in modern history. Chris attacked Shanann in their bedroom. Straddling her body, he strangled her as she fought for her life. Later, he would attempt to frame this as a crime of passion. But investigators and prosecutors argued that his actions were deliberate and cold-blooded. Within minutes, Shanann was gone. Her life ended at the hands of the man she had loved and trusted most. But the horror did not stop there. Unbeknownst to Chris, his daughters Bella and Celeste had been awake during the struggle. The sound of their mother being attacked startled them, and they wandered into the room. Little Bella, just 4 years old, asked her father, "What's wrong with Mommy?" In that moment, Chris faced a choice. He could have stopped. He could have broken down, called for help, and confessed to what he had done. Instead, he doubled down on his monstrous plan. He wrapped Shannon's body in a bedsheet, dragging it down the stairs to his work truck. He placed her body on the floorboard, and then he loaded his daughters into the back seat, alive, confused, and terrified. Chris then drove them out to a remote oil site owned by his company, Anadarko Petroleum. It was a location he knew well, an isolated spot far from neighbors or passers-by. During that drive, the unimaginable occurred. Bella and Celeste, strapped into their seats, sat just inches away from their mother's lifeless body. They were too young to understand the full scope of what was happening. But they knew something was terribly wrong. At one point, Bella asked her father, "Is Mommy okay?" Chris stayed silent. When they arrived at the oil site, Chris carried out the final stage of his plan. He first turned on his daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, who called him Daddy with trust and innocence, were smothered one after the other. Chris later admitted that Bella fought the hardest, pleading with him as he covered her face. Her final words were reportedly, "Daddy, no," after murdering his children. Chris disposed of their bodies in a way that shocked even seasoned investigators. He stuffed Bella and Celeste into separate oil tanks, each just 8 inches in diameter. The crude oil concealed their bodies, making them difficult to locate. As for Shanann, he buried her in a shallow grave nearby, leaving her and her unborn son, Nico, discarded in the dirt. With his crime complete, Chris attempted to stage a facade of normalcy. he returned home, showered, and went to work as if nothing had happened. He even texted Shannon's phone, knowing she would never reply, in an effort to create the illusion that she was still alive. But his charade began to unravel within hours. When Shanann failed to show up for her doctor's appointment that morning, her friend Nicole Atkinson grew concerned. Nicole knew Shanann well. She wasn't the type to miss important commitments, especially when it came to her pregnancy. Nicole repeatedly tried calling and texting Shanann, but there was no answer. By early afternoon, her worry turned to alarm, and she drove to the Watts' home to check in. Nicole rang the doorbell and knocked, but no one answered. She then called Chris, who acted calm and unconcerned, claiming Shanann might have gone to a friend's house. Unsatisfied, Nicole contacted the police for a welfare check. That decision would crack open the case. When officers arrived, body cam footage captured their interactions with Chris. He appeared nervous, but attempted to act cooperative. He allowed them inside the home, where Shannon's purse, phone, and medications were all found untouched. A clear sign she hadn't simply left on her own. The officers also noted Chris's odd behavior. While most husbands in such a situation would appear frantic, Chris remained strangely detached, offering explanations that felt rehearsed. Neighbors also chimed in. One neighbor's security camera showed Chris backing his truck into the garage early that morning, something he had never done before. The neighbor told police that Chris was not acting right, describing his demeanor as unusual and jittery. Over the next 48 hours, Chris attempted to maintain his lies. He gave interviews to local news stations, pleading for his family's safe return. Standing on his porch, he spoke about how much he missed his daughters and how desperately he wanted Shanann to come home. But his body language told a different story. His lack of emotion, his stiff mannerisms, and his inability to make eye contact all raised suspicions. Behind the scenes, investigators were closing in. During questioning, Chris failed a polygraph test, a pivotal moment that led to his eventual confession. At first, he attempted to blame Shanann, claiming that she had killed the children in a fit of rage and that he had killed her in response. But this version of events quickly collapsed under the weight of evidence. Finally, Chris admitted the truth. He had killed Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, and disposed of their bodies at his worksite. The cold-blooded nature of the crime stunned even veteran detectives. It wasn't just the murder of a wife. It was the deliberate annihilation of an entire family, carried out with chilling precision. The story spread like wildfire across the nation, drawing comparisons to other infamous family annihilators. How could a seemingly ordinary man, who neighbors described as polite and quiet, commit such unimaginable atrocities? The answer, many believed, lay in Chris's desire to erase his past life and replace it with a fantasy. But the cost of that fantasy was the destruction of the very people who loved and trusted him most. When Chris Watts finally confessed to the murders of his wife and daughters, the world recoiled in horror. The truth was even darker than many had imagined, and the community of Frederick, Colorado, was left shattered. The perfect family image had collapsed completely, replaced by the reality of a man who had annihilated his entire household for the chance at a new life. After his confession, authorities quickly moved to recover the bodies. On August 16, 2018, investigators discovered Shanann's shallow grave near an oil site owned by Chris's employer, Anadarko Petroleum. Just yards away, they located the oil tanks where Bella and Celeste had been hidden. The discovery shocked even hardened detectives. The idea that a father could force his daughters' small bodies into such confined, industrial containers left many speechless. The public reaction was swift and intense. News outlets across the country carried the story, and social media exploded with outrage. Chris Watts was no longer just a local suspect. He had become a national symbol of betrayal and cruelty. People questioned how a man who appeared so normal could harbor such violence. Following his arrest, Chris was charged with multiple counts. 5 counts of first-degree murder, including additional charges for the deaths of his daughters because they were children under the age of 12. 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased body. The weight of the charges was immense, ensuring that Chris would never see freedom again. At first, Chris tried to maintain fragments of his earlier lies, suggesting that Shanann had harmed the girls and that he had only killed her in retaliation. But prosecutors quickly dismantled this claim. The evidence overwhelmingly pointed to premeditation and intent. The timeline of his actions, the way he concealed the bodies, and his attempts to manipulate public perception all spoke to a calculated plan rather than a sudden moment of passion. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Chris made a decision. In November 2018, he accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. Shannon's family, though devastated, supported the deal, not wanting to endure a drawn-out trial that would force them to relive the gruesome details of her death and the deaths of the children. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was heavy with grief. Shannon's parents and brother spoke through tears, describing the unbearable pain of losing their daughter and grandchildren. The district attorney described the murders as the most inhumane and vicious crime he had ever encountered. When it was Chris's turn to speak, he offered only a brief, emotionless apology, a statement many found hollow and inadequate given the scale of his crimes. The judge handed down 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the unlawful termination of Shannon's pregnancy and the tampering with the bodies. Chris Watts was led out of the courtroom, never to return to the outside world again. But the story didn't end there. Inside prison, Chris quickly became a figure of fascination. Inmates despised him for his crimes, particularly because they involved children, but they also recognized his infamy. At Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, where he was later transferred for his own safety, Chris was kept largely in isolation. Reports suggest he spends most of his days reading the Bible, praying, and corresponding with outsiders who write to him. Shockingly, despite the heinous nature of his crimes, Chris has received letters of sympathy, love, and even marriage proposals from strangers who claim to see him as misunderstood. This bizarre phenomenon is not uncommon in high-profile criminal cases, but has fueled even greater outrage among those who grieve for Shanann and her children. In rare interviews, Chris has spoken about his actions. He admitted that he thought killing his family would somehow allow him to be with his mistress, free of responsibility and burden. Yet he also admitted to feelings of guilt and despair, acknowledging that he has destroyed not only his own life, but the lives of everyone connected to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico. Some experts argue that Chris continues to manipulate the narrative even behind bars, shifting blame or minimizing his responsibility. Others see his quiet demeanor as proof of his chilling detachment. The Watts case quickly became the subject of books, documentaries, and countless true crime discussions. Netflix's 2020 documentary American Murder: The Family Next Door drew millions of viewers. Using Shannon's own social media posts and police body cam footage to retell the story. The documentary left audiences stunned at how ordinary the Watts family seemed before the murders, underscoring the terrifying idea that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary doors. Beyond entertainment, the case has been studied by psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement experts, trying to understand what drives family annihilators. Chris Watts is often compared to other men who, feeling trapped or desperate, chose to wipe out their families rather than face divorce, financial ruin, or public shame. Experts suggest that men like Chris often see their families not as loved ones, but as extensions of themselves, objects they can erase when they threaten their desires. For Shannon's family, the pain remains constant. They have spoken publicly about their grief, their anger, and their determination to keep Shannon's memory alive. Shannon's father, Frank Zusek, has described the nightmare of losing his daughter and grandchildren as something he relives every day. Her brother, Frankie, has used social media to defend Shannon's honor against internet conspiracies and to ensure that the truth of her story is not forgotten. The Watts family home in Frederick also became a symbol of the tragedy. For years, it sat empty, a chilling reminder of what had happened within its walls. Neighbors reported that people would drive by just to stare, unable to look away from the sight of such horrific acts. Today, Chris Watts remains in prison, serving out his multiple life sentences. His story continues to captivate the public, not because of who he was, but because of what he destroyed. The Watts case serves as a haunting reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that social media images of perfection can mask deep dysfunction, and that even those closest to us can sometimes harbor unimaginable darkness. In the end, the legacy of Chris Watts is not one of love, family, or redemption. It is one of betrayal, brutality, and loss. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico are remembered not only as victims, but as symbols of innocence stolen by the very person who was supposed to protect them. And while Chris spends the rest of his life behind bars, the true punishment lies not only in confinement, but in the fact that his name will forever be synonymous with one of the most chilling crimes of modern times: the annihilation of an entire family in the pursuit of a selfish fantasy.